Imagine giving a man everything, your mother's business, your savings, your youth, even the child you lost while suffering alone on a cold bathroom floor, only for him to divorce you, replace you with a younger woman, and then send you a wedding invitation just to watch you sit in the crowd and see how far he'd risen without you. That's exactly what Garrison Vance did. He thought his ex-wife would arrive broken, ashamed, forgotten. But on the day of his billion-dollar wedding, 3 black SUVs rolled through the gates, and the woman he once called not enough stepped out looking like a verdict. What happened next left 200 guests speechless, shattered a billionaire's perfect wedding, exposed a secret that would cost him his empire, and forced him to face the one thing he had spent 3 years running from, the true price of what he had done to the woman who loved him most. Stay with me, because this story isn't about revenge. It's about the moment a man realizes he traded a diamond for glass. Hello, beautiful people, and welcome back to Alcott Stories. I'm your storyteller, James, and today I bring you a powerful story of betrayal, heartbreak, resilience, and a woman who discovered her true worth after being underestimated by the man she loved most. Before we begin, please take a moment to like this video, subscribe to Alcott Stories, and turn on the notification bell so you never miss another unforgettable story. And here's today's question. If someone betrayed you, humiliated you, and threw away your love, would you choose revenge? Or would you choose to become so successful that your happiness became the answer? Let me know your thoughts in the comments below. Now settle in and let's begin today's incredible story. The envelope arrived on a Tuesday, not in an email, not a text. An actual physical envelope, cream-colored and heavy, the kind that costs more than most people's groceries for the week. It had been slipped under the door of Evie's downtown Atlanta office sometime between 7 and 9 in the morning, because when her assistant Jade knocked and handed it to her at 9:14, there was no stamp on it. Someone had delivered it by hand. Evangeline Sterling. She had been using her married name for just over a year now, and it still felt like wearing a well-fitted coat she hadn't known she needed. Looked at the outside of the envelope for a long moment before she touched it. Her name was written in formal calligraphy, not a printed label. Someone had actually taken a pen to paper Evangeline Vance, not Sterling. Vance. She noticed that immediately. She set her coffee cup down on the glass desk, picked up the envelope with 2 fingers like it might bite, and opened it cleanly along the top fold. The invitation was stunning, she'd give him that. Thick cardstock the color of winter clouds, embossed gold lettering, an intricate design of white roses winding around the border. At the top in clean serif font it read, "You are cordially invited to celebrate the wedding of Garrison Aurelius Vance and Cynthia Rose Laurent, the Whispering Pines Estate, Savannah, Georgia, Saturday, the 14th of September. Ceremony begins at 4 o'clock in the afternoon." Evie read it twice, slowly. Then she set it flat on her desk and just looked at it, the way you look at something that doesn't quite make sense yet, waiting for your brain to catch up with your eyes. Garrison was getting married. That part she already knew. It had been in the society pages 3 weeks ago, a 2-page spread in Southern Elite magazine with photographs of Garrison in a white shirt with his collar open, his arm around a very young, very blonde woman who looked at the camera like she was already practicing for the wedding portrait. Evie had seen the article because her assistant had accidentally left the magazine on her desk without realizing. She'd looked at it for maybe 4 seconds, turned the page, and gone back to the Sterling Capital Acquisition report she'd been reviewing. She had felt almost nothing. That had surprised her, actually. She had expected something, a flutter, a sting, an old familiar ache. But what she'd felt was closer to the way you feel when you drive past a house you used to live in as a child. Recognition. Distance, a vague awareness that it once mattered enormously. But this envelope was different. This was deliberate. Garrison Vance did not do things by accident. She knew that about him better than almost anyone alive. Every word he chose, every gesture he made in public, every person he invited into a room, it was all considered, calculated, placed with the precision of someone who had spent years studying how power worked and who had mastered it. He had not sent this invitation out of nostalgia. He had not sent it because some part of him wanted to make peace. He had sent it because he wanted her to sit in the crowd and watch. Evie leaned back in her chair and pressed her fingers lightly against her lips, thinking. Her office on the 22nd floor looked out over the Atlanta skyline, the glass wall catching the September morning light and spreading it across the room in long, warm columns. She had designed this office herself 2 years ago when Sterling Consultancy had moved into the building. Warm cream walls, dark walnut furniture, a single framed photograph of her mother on the bookshelf beside her degrees, a small potted magnolia tree near the window. The magnolia had been Alistair's idea. Something from home, he'd said, and she'd looked at him in that quiet way she had when something touched her more than she expected. And she hadn't said a word, just pulled the small pot toward her and set it in the sun. She picked up her phone and called Maeve. It rang once. "Tell me why I'm looking at a wedding invitation from Garrison Vance," Evie said without greeting a pause. Then Maeve's voice sharp and loaded. "He did not, he did, he actually," a sound on Maeve's end like something being set down hard. "Evie, that man invited you to watch him marry his 24-year-old trophy. That is deliberate," Evie said simply. "I was going to say disgusting, but yes, also deliberate." Maeve's voice shifted, lower and more careful. "Are you okay?" "I'm fine. I need more than fine. I need you to actually tell me how you feel." Evie looked at the invitation again. She thought about what it would have meant to her 3 years ago to receive something like this. She thought about the version of herself who had sat on a cold bathroom floor at 2 in the morning, bleeding and alone, biting down on a washcloth so she wouldn't make a sound and break Garrison's concentration during pitch prep week. She thought about the version of herself who had packed 2 bags because she couldn't bear to touch anything that had been paid for with her mother's memory. "I feel like he thinks he still has power over me," she said, "and I find that genuinely interesting." Maeve was quiet for exactly 3 seconds. "You're going to go, aren't you?" It wasn't a question. Evie looked out the window at the Atlanta skyline, the morning light catching the glass towers all around her, the city moving and breathing below like something alive. "I need to make a call," she said. Alistair was in Boston when she reached him. She could hear the particular quality of silence in whatever room he was in, that thick, high-sailing quiet of old money buildings, the kind that absorbed sound rather than reflecting it. He picked up on the second ring. "Garrison invited me to his wedding," she said, a beat. "I know." She paused. "You know, Marcus told me this morning. Apparently the invitation list was leaked to the society press. Your name was on it." His voice was calm and unhurried, the way it always was. Alistair Sterling had the rare quality of a man who was never in a rush, not because he lacked urgency, but because he had long since stopped needing to prove anything to anyone. "He also put your maiden name on it, Vance. Not Sterling. I noticed that. He wants the crowd to see you as the woman he left behind," Alistair said. "He wants you walking in there feeling like a footnote." Evie said nothing. She was turning the envelope over in her hand. "We could simply not go," Alistair said. "It's one Saturday. Savannah in September is beautiful, but we've been." A pause, and she could hear the particular warmth in his voice that he reserved only for her. "Though I suspect you've already made your decision." "The Meridian Review is scheduled for Monday," Evie said. Another pause. "Longer this time, Evie." His voice shifted slower now. "Are you sure? He built everything on borrowed dignity," she said. "My mother's ring, my savings, my health. I never asked him to account for any of it. I just left." She stopped, swallowed once. "But I want him to know. I want to look him in the eye just once and let him understand what he was actually looking at when he looked at me." Alistair was quiet for a moment, and she knew he was sitting with it, turning it over the way he did everything, not rushing to an answer, but actually thinking. It was one of the first things she had loved about him. He listened like words had weight. "All right," he said finally. And she could hear something in his voice she recognized as pride, quiet and steady. "Then we go. And we do it right. 3 SUVs, she said. 3 SUVs. He agreed. She almost smiled. "You're going to enjoy this, Evie." There was a warmth in his voice so deep it almost undid her. "I have been waiting 3 years to watch the world see you clearly, so yes, little." She pressed her fingers against her eyes for a second, composing herself. "I'll call you tonight," she said. "I'll be home by 7. A pause, and "Evie, wear the copper emerald, the one from Paris." She looked down at the invitation one more time, at the gold lettering and the white roses and the name written in someone's careful calligraphy, Evangeline Vance. "I will," she said, and ended the call. She spent the rest of that morning working because that was what she did. She worked with the kind of focused, precise energy that had taken her from a folding table in a rented room to a 22nd floor corner office in 2 years flat. But somewhere in the middle of reviewing a contract clause, her hand drifted to the small framed photograph on her bookshelf, her mother, Claudette Moreau, taken outside the Magnolia Diner on a summer morning 20 years ago, a wide-brimmed hat and an apron, laughing at whoever was behind the camera with the full, unguarded laugh of a woman completely at home in her own life. The Magnolia Diner had been her mother's life's work, a small, beautiful, historic restaurant in Augusta, Georgia. Low ceilings, warm light, the smell of butter and thyme permanently worked into the walls. It had been in the Moreau family for 31 years. Her mother had cooked there every single day until the week she got sick, and she'd left it to Evie with a handwritten note tucked in an envelope that simply said, "This is who we are, baby. Don't ever let the world tell you different." Evie had sold it. She'd sold it because Garrison needed the money, and she had loved him, and she had believed, the way only a person who is truly, completely in love believes, that what she was building with him was worth the cost. She found out later, almost by accident, that Garrison had known the diner's estimated value was nearly 4 times what the sale had generated. He'd pushed for a quick sale to a developer who'd turned it into a parking structure within 8 months. Evie looked at her mother's photograph for a long time. Then she straightened her back, turned the page on her contract review, and kept working. She had learned something in the years since Garrison, something she hadn't expected to learn, something that had come quietly through Alistair's patience and her own grinding, inch by inch rebuilding. She had learned that the most powerful thing a woman could do was not explode, not collapse, not disappear. It was to simply become so completely herself that the person who underestimated her had to reckon with the distance between what they imagined and what was actually standing in front of them. September 14th was 3 weeks away. Evie closed the contract file, pulled up a new document, and began drafting the Meridian Capital agenda for Monday. She had work to do. What she did not know, what no one except Alistair and his senior partner Marcus Webb knew, was that the acquisition of Vance Logistical Systems had been completed quietly 6 weeks ago. The filing had been done through 3 shell subsidiaries in Delaware, a structure so clean and unremarkable that Garrison's own legal team had flagged it as routine investor activity. The 51% majority stake now rested entirely with Meridian Capital, Alistair's primary hedge fund vehicle. Garrison Vance did not know his company was no longer his. He did not know that the woman whose name he had written in the wrong font on an expensive cream envelope was sitting 22 floors above Atlanta, reviewing the contract that governed his professional survival. He did not know any of it. He was busy planning a wedding, and somewhere in a Boston hotel suite, Alistair Sterling was on the phone with his tailor, asking whether the charcoal suit would be ready by Friday. 3 SUVs, he was thinking, let them look. Garrison Vance had a ritual every morning. He woke at 5:45 without an alarm. His body had learned years ago that successful men didn't need to be told when to rise. He showered with water set to exactly 62 degrees, cold enough to shock the system into full alertness. He dressed in whichever suit his personal stylist had laid out the night before. He stood at the floor-to-ceiling window of his Savannah penthouse with a black coffee, no sugar, and he looked at the city below him the way a man looks at something he owns. He had done this every morning for 3 years. This particular morning, 9 days before the wedding, he stood at that window longer than usual. The city was still mostly dark at that hour, the early September sky a deep bruised blue with just the first thin thread of orange pressing up along the horizon. Savannah was a beautiful city, old and layered, all Spanish moss and cobblestone, and the particular kind of southern elegance that had been built over centuries. Garrison had chosen it deliberately when he'd relocated Vance Logistical Systems headquarters. New York was obvious, Atlanta was crowded. Savannah said something different. It said established, it said legacy. It said the kind of money that didn't need to announce itself loudly, because it had been there long enough to become part of the architecture. He sipped his coffee and thought about the invitation. He had sent it 3 weeks ago. His assistant had questioned it very carefully in the way people who worked for Garrison learned to question things, obliquely, with no direct challenge in her voice. "Mr. Vance, should I confirm the full guest list before the print run?" And he had said, "Evangeline Vance, Augusta address. Make sure it's hand-delivered." His assistant had not asked again. He told himself it was about closure. He had rehearsed that framing carefully, the way he rehearsed most things he intended to say to himself in the quiet hours. It's closure. It's generous, even. Letting her see the life she could have been part of. Letting her make peace with the past, but beneath that, in the place he didn't examine closely, was something more honest and considerably less flattering. He wanted her to see it, all of it. The Whispering Pines estate with its 200 guests and its imported white roses and its string quartet. The stunning young bride, the life he had built. He wanted to watch Evangeline Moreau Vance sit in a white chair in someone else's dress and understand, finally and completely, that she had not been enough. He finished his coffee, set the cup on the ledge, straightened his cuffs. He had not, even for 1 second, considered the possibility that she might arrive as anything other than what he had decided she was. The offices of Vance Logistical Systems occupied the top 4 floors of a glass tower on the edge of Savannah's historic district, close enough to the old city to suggest rootedness, far enough from it to signal modernity. Garrison had overseen every detail of the design himself, from the imported Italian marble in the lobby to the specific temperature at which the climate control ran on the executive floor. He walked in at 7:15 and the lobby security desk straightened almost imperceptibly as he passed. He always noticed, his chief of staff, a lean, efficient man named Denton Cole, was already in the executive corridor with a tablet, falling into step beside him without needing to be summoned. This was one of the things Garrison paid for. People who anticipated, people who did not make him wait. "Morning rundown," Garrison said, not looking at him. "Board pre-meeting at 9. The Hargrove acquisition presentation is finalized. Legal needs 30 minutes with you at 11 regarding the Delaware filings. Apparently there's been some routine investor activity flagged in the Q3 audit. Nothing significant. They just want your signature on a clarification document." Denton kept pace effortlessly. Wedding coordinator called. "The florals are confirmed. 4,000 white roses, delivery on Thursday. And your mother arrives from Charleston Friday evening." At the mention of his mother, Garrison's jaw tightened almost invisibly. "What's her ETA?" 6:15. "I've arranged the car. Good. Put her in the East Wing suite. And make sure there's a separate dining arrangement for Friday evening. I need the rehearsal dinner to run smoothly, and she has opinions about the seating chart that I don't have time for this week." Denton made a note without comment. Eleanor Vance had opinions about most things. She had opinions about the wedding flowers, too traditional. About Cynthia's dress, not couture enough for a Vance wedding. About the guest list, why were the Hartwell family seated so close to the fountain? They were new money. She had strong opinions about Savannah itself, which she found charming but slightly provincial for a man of Garrison's standing. She had been the one 3 years ago who had first said the words that Garrison had eventually accepted as simply true. "She doesn't fit, Garrison. I know you care for her, but look at the rooms you need to walk into now. Look at the tables you need to sit at. She's a sweet girl, but she's not built for this world." He had argued at first. He remembered that. The first 3 or 4 times Eleanor had said it, in various ways he had pushed back, but the arguments got shorter each time. And then, one evening, sitting across from Evie at their kitchen table, her in a second-hand sweater, her hair up in a loose knot, going over their utility bills on a yellow legal pad, he had looked at her and felt something he hadn't expected. Not love in that moment, but a cold, calculating distance. He had looked at her the way a man looks at something that no longer fits the future he is constructing. He had never told her that he hadn't needed to. She had found out in a text she wasn't supposed to see, and she had left without drama, without lawyers, without anything except 2 bags and her mother's photograph, and he had watched her go with a feeling he had categorized at the time as relief. He pushed the memory away. He was good at that. The board meeting at 9 ran long. The Hargrove acquisition, a mid-size freight and logistics company operating primarily in the Gulf Coast region, was a clean deal, and Garrison's presentation was precise and authoritative. He knew these rooms. He knew how to stand at the head of a conference table and speak with the particular weight of a man whose confidence had never publicly faltered. Afterward, over coffee, his board member and oldest professional ally, a silver-haired man named Franklin Cross, clapped him on the shoulder. "Big week for you, Garrison. Wedding Saturday, Hargrove signing Tuesday. You're having a moment." Garrison smiled, that practiced, calibrated smile. Building a legacy takes timing. "How's Cynthia?" "Radiant," he said. And she was, technically. Cynthia Rose Laurent was 24, striking in photographs, effortlessly decorative at galas and charity functions, and utterly uninterested in the mechanisms of Garrison's business, which suited him perfectly. She laughed at the right moments. She wore things well. She understood instinctively that her role in his life was aesthetic and social, and she performed it without complaint. She was the opposite of Evie in almost every measurable way. He had told himself that was what he wanted. "I heard a rumor," Franklin said, lowering his voice with the conspiratorial pleasure of a man who enjoyed possessing information. "About the Delaware filing, the Q3 audit flagged some investor movement in the parent equity structure. Nothing visible in the trade data, but whispers in the market that someone's been quietly accumulating. Legal's handling it," Garrison said smoothly. "Routine institutional movement. We're solid." Franklin nodded, but something in his eyes didn't quite settle. "Of course. Just worth keeping an eye on." Garrison didn't give it another thought. He had other things to manage. He called Cynthia at noon from his office. She picked up on the fourth ring, slightly breathless, some music playing faintly in the background, her friend group, a rotation of models and socialites, perpetually somewhere expensive and moderately loud. "Baby," she said, which was what she called him, a word he had once found charming and now occasionally grated in a way he did not examine. "Final dress fitting is confirmed for Thursday," he said. "Are you in Savannah?" "Flying in Wednesday evening. Solange is doing my hair and she can only do Thursday afternoon, so we might need to shift the rehearsal timing. The rehearsal stays at 7. Hair can happen before 4. He said it without harshness but also without negotiation. "And Cynthia, the guest list, I need you to be Grace this weekend. There will be people there who knew me from before. Some of them may say things." A pause. "What kind of things?" "Old business, old stories. People like to remind billionaires of their humble origins at weddings. It's a sport." He kept his voice light. "Just smile and stay close to me. Is this about the ex-wife being invited?" Her voice had changed. It was careful now. Garrison paused. "Who told you that?" "Your mother mentioned it when she called me last week." A beat. "Garrison, why would you invite her? Like, why would you do that?" "Because I want her to see what she walked away from," he said, and it came out cleaner and more honest than he intended, stripped of the closure framing he'd rehearsed. Cynthia was quiet for a moment. "That's kind of cruel," she said, not angry, just observational in the simple, direct way she occasionally said things that surprised him with their accuracy. "It's just a guest," Garrison said. Cynthia didn't respond to that. The music continued in the background. "I'll be there Wednesday," she said, and ended the call. Garrison set his phone face down on the desk and looked out the window at the Savannah skyline. He wasn't cruel. He wasn't. He had simply built something extraordinary, and he wanted the people who had doubted him, the people who had left or who he'd had to leave behind, to understand the scale of it. That wasn't cruelty. That was clarity. That was a man who had reached the summit, standing at the top of it and pointing downward. He had worked for this. He had earned it. What arrived on his desk Thursday morning, tucked inside the routine legal package from his corporate counsel, should have been the first real alarm bell. But because it was buried in 40 pages of standard acquisition clarification documents, and because Denton summarized it as routine Delaware investor notation, "Sign here," Garrison initialed it without reading past the header. He had a final tuxedo fitting at 2. He had 4,000 white roses arriving at the estate. He had a wedding in 48 hours. He did not read the full document. Inside page 31, buried in dense contractual language about equity structure and fiduciary transfer rights, was a clause that had been drafted 8 weeks ago in a Boston law office by a man named Marcus Webb, senior partner at Meridian Capital. The clause read in part, upon confirmation of transfer, controlling interest 51.3 miles of Vance Logistical Systems, Inc., including all subsidiary holdings, shall vest in Meridian Capital Partners, with full board oversight rights effective the first Monday following the close of fiscal Q3. The first Monday following the close of fiscal Q3 was September 16th. 2 days after the wedding, Garrison initialed the page, Denton collected the documents, and somewhere in a copper emerald dress hanging in a garment bag in an Atlanta hotel suite, the future was already dressed and waiting. Friday evening, Eleanor Vance arrived at the estate in a black car, impeccably dressed as always, her silver-white hair swept back in the severe, elegant style she had worn for 30 years. She walked through the front entrance of Whispering Pines and stood in the grand foyer, looking up at the vaulted ceiling and the cascading arrangements of white roses that had already been placed along the staircase, and allowed herself a small, satisfied nod. This was what she had worked toward. Not just this wedding, this moment. The Vance name elevated beyond the modest, unremarkable origins that Eleanor had spent decades outrunning. Her son standing at the top of the social architecture she had always believed he deserved. She had not liked Evangeline. Not from the first meeting, when Garrison had brought her home, a warm, laughing, deeply beautiful young woman with her mother's cooking and her grandmother's strength and absolutely none of the social polish Eleanor had decided was necessary. She had not disliked her because Evie was unpleasant. Evie had been genuinely, almost irritatingly kind. She had disliked her because she had seen in Evie's eyes something she recognized and feared. A woman who did not need Garrison's world to feel complete. Women like that, Eleanor had always believed, were dangerous to men like Garrison. They didn't stay grateful, they didn't stay small, and eventually they stopped fitting neatly into the frame. So Eleanor had applied pressure, gradually and consistently, the way you apply pressure to a seam until it splits. And it had split. And she had told herself she had protected her son. She walked into the main reception hall and accepted a glass of champagne from a passing server, looked out through the tall windows at the estate grounds, the weeping willows, the fountain, the stone pathways wound with white rose garlands, and felt entirely at peace. She said to no one in particular. She did not know, as she stood there, that somewhere north of her, 3 black SUVs were being arranged by a logistics coordinator who worked for a security firm that regularly operated for Meridian Capital. She did not know that the woman she had helped push out of her son's life was currently sitting in an Atlanta hotel room, her honey-brown skin glowing in the warm light of a vanity mirror, while her best friend Maeve zipped up the back of a copper emerald gown with slightly trembling hands and whispered, "Evie, you look like a verdict." And she did not know that her son had signed away his company without reading past the header, because he trusted that nothing truly important could arrive wrapped in something so ordinary. That was Eleanor Vance's deepest error, and her son's too. They had both, for years, confused packaging with value. Tomorrow they would understand the difference. The morning of September 14th arrived the way significant days sometimes do, quietly, without fanfare, as if the world hadn't yet decided what it was going to become. Savannah woke slowly that Saturday. The September heat was already present at 7 in the morning, warm and thick with the particular humidity of coastal Georgia, the kind that softened every edge and made the Spanish moss hang heavier in the live oak trees. The sky was a deep, cloudless blue that would deepen further as the day wore on, the kind of sky that photographers pray for and brides consider a personal gift. At the Whispering Pines estate, everything was already in motion by 8. The florist team had been there since 6, finishing the installations. 4,000 white roses, as ordered, wound through every iron railing, every archway, every table centerpiece, every stone pathway leading from the main gate to the ceremony lawn. The estate itself was a masterpiece of southern architecture, 3 stories of pale limestone and dark timber, wide verandas wrapping the front and sides, enormous windows catching the morning light and throwing it back gold. The grounds were immaculate. The weeping willows stood along the property's edge like old sentinels, their long tendrils brushing the manicured grass, and the central fountain, marble, 19th century, a woman pouring water from a vessel that never emptied, caught the early light and scattered it across the nearby hedgerows. It was, by every visible measure, the most beautiful wedding venue in 3 states. Garrison stood on the upper veranda at 8:15, coffee in hand, looking at all of it. He was in this moment as close to genuinely happy as he allowed himself to be. The machinery was running, everything was where it should be. In 7 hours he would stand at the end of that rose-lined stone path and marry a woman the world would photograph beautifully, and the last remaining trace of his origin story, the apartment, the debt, the desperate years, would finally be fully buried. His phone buzzed. His mother. "The centerpieces at table 7 need to be moved," Eleanor said without greeting. "They're blocking the sight line from the family seating. Good morning, Mother." "The sight line, Garrison. I'll tell the coordinator." He looked out over the grounds. "How's Cynthia?" "Getting her done. She seems—" A pause. "Quieter than I expected. Bridal nerves, I imagine." Garrison thought of Cynthia's voice on the phone 2 days ago. "That's kind of cruel," he dismissed it. "She'll be fine once the ceremony begins. I want to discuss the seating for the Hargreave family." "Mother," he kept his voice even. "It's my wedding day. The seating is handled. I'll see you at 3. He ended the call and went inside to dress. 4 hours north, in a suite on the 14th floor of an Atlanta hotel, 3 things were happening simultaneously. Maeve was standing behind Evie at the full-length mirror, applying the final pin to the copper emerald gown with the focused expression of someone performing surgery. The dress had been made in Paris, not bought off a rack but constructed, piece by piece, by a French Ivorian designer named Celestine Okafor, who had taken one look at Evangeline Sterling's measurements and skin tone and quietly declared that she would make something that no room could ignore. The copper emerald, a color that shifted between deep forest green and warm burnished copper depending on the light, moved against Evie's honey-brown skin the way water moves against river stones. It made her look less like a woman who had been invited to a wedding and more like a woman the wedding had not been prepared for. Maeve stepped back and looked. "Evie," she said softly. Evie looked at herself in the mirror. Really looked, the way she rarely allowed herself to. Not for vanity, but because full self-perception required a kind of courage she had learned to ration carefully. She had done her own makeup, as she always did. She had a light hand and a precise eye. Her mother had taught her that less was always more, that a woman's face was not a canvas for insecurity. Her deep amber eyes were framed cleanly, a line of dark coal along the upper lid, a soft copper at the outer corners. Her thick dark hair had been pinned up in an elegant, deliberately imperfect arrangement that showed the clean line of her neck and jaw. At her throat, a single piece of jewelry, a thin gold chain with a small emerald pendant that Alistair had placed around her neck at breakfast that morning without ceremony, as if it were simply the natural final note. She looked at the woman in the mirror, and she thought for one quiet moment about the version of herself who had packed 2 bags. That woman had been real. The grief had been real. The bathroom floor had been real. The cold tiles, the silence she had maintained with her whole body so that Garrison's concentration wouldn't break. That woman had existed and she had suffered and she deserved acknowledgement, not erasure. But she was not that woman anymore. "You look like a verdict," Maeve said, which was exactly the right thing to say. Evie's mouth curved. "I feel like one." A knock at the suite door. Maeve opened it and there was Alistair. He was in the charcoal suit, slim, perfectly cut, the kind of suit made by people who understood that the best clothing made the man look more like himself, not less. His silver-grey eyes found Evie across the room and stayed there, and something in his expression shifted in the way it always did when he saw her. Not performance, not display, just a man who was genuinely moved and had long since stopped trying to hide it. He walked toward her slowly. He put his hands gently at her waist and looked at her for a moment. "There she is," he said quietly. She held his gaze. "Don't make me cry. I just finished my makeup. I'm not trying to." He pressed a brief, careful kiss to her temple. "The cars are downstairs. Marcus is already at the estate. He arrived this morning as a press liaison for the investor group. He'll be inside when we arrive." A pause. "You don't have to do anything today, Evie. We can just go, be seen and leave. That's enough." She reached into her small copper clutch. Inside, wrapped carefully in a square of folded velvet, was something small and silver, A worn thumb ring, simple and plain, the kind of ring that had belonged to a woman who had cooked and laughed and built something with her hands. Alistair had found it 18 months ago through an estate recovery specialist, tracking it through 3 pawn transactions across 2 counties. He had placed it in her hands one evening without context, and she had looked at it and not spoken for a very long time. Her mother's ring, the one Garrison had pawned during the bankruptcy year, she had carried it with her every day since. She had not yet decided what to do with it, but she knew now. "I have one thing to say to him," she said. "One moment, and then I'm done." Alistair nodded. He offered his arm. She took it behind them. Maeve straightened her jacket, picked up her bag, and said to no one in particular, "Lord have mercy on that wedding." The 3 black SUVs departed Atlanta at 11:15, traveling south towards Savannah in the clean, unhurried way of people who have nowhere to be except exactly where they're going. Evie sat in the middle vehicle, her hand in Alistair's, watching Georgia move past the tinted window, the pine forests and red clay shoulders and occasional small towns that appeared and vanished in seconds, their gas stations and Baptist churches and hand-painted signs all belonging to a world that moved at a different pace than the one she now inhabited. She thought about her mother, as she often did when she drove through this part of the state. Claudette Moreau had driven this highway once a month to visit her sister in Savannah, always in the same battered green station wagon, always with a foil-covered dish on the back seat because you did not visit family empty-handed. She had been a woman of enormous, unshowy dignity, the kind that came not from wealth or status but from absolute clarity about who she was and what she valued. She had taught Evie to cook, to balance a ledger, to look people directly in the eye, and to never, under any circumstances, apologize for taking up space you were made for every room, she used to say. "The world just hasn't caught up yet." Evie looked down at her copper clutch. "You okay?" Alistair asked. "Thinking about my mother," she said. He turned her hand over in his and pressed his thumb gently to her palm. He did not say anything else because he had understood from very early in their relationship that some moments did not need filling. He had learned that about her slowly, carefully, the way you learn something you want to get exactly right. She was not a woman who needed to be fixed or saved or managed. She needed to be witnessed, and he had been paying attention from the start. She closed her eyes for a moment, felt the motion of the car, the warmth of his hand. Then she opened her eyes, sat up straight, and looked forward. The Whispering Pines estate gates came into view at 3:40. The guest arrivals were in full swing, a long line of luxury vehicles moving slowly up the gravel drive. Men in morning suits and women in various interpretation of garden party elegance filling the flagstone pathways. A white-gloved valet team worked with practiced efficiency. A string quartet played somewhere near the main entrance, the music drifting out across the grounds with the white rose scent, wrapping the whole scene in an atmosphere of studied perfection. Garrison was already at the ceremony lawn, standing at the altar position with his groomsmen, running through final placement with the coordinator. He was in a white tuxedo, custom Italian, precisely fitted, and he looked exactly the way he had always intended to look on this day, powerful, polished, and untouchable. His best man, a broad-shouldered, loud-lawing man named Theo Burke, who had known Garrison since their second year of business school, clapped him on the back. "This is it, brother, this is the day." Garrison straightened his cuffs. "Yes," he said, "it is." He did not know that at that precise moment, at the main gate, 3 blacked-out SUVs had turned off the public road and were rolling slowly up the gravel drive. The thing about a convoy is that it has a sound before it has a presence. The guests nearest the driveway heard it first. Not loudness, but the low, measured crunch of expensive tires on gravel moving in coordinated formation, the specific quality of 3 heavy vehicles traveling at the same unhurried pace. People turned. A woman near the fountain touched her companion's arm. Someone near the rose arch said something in a low voice. The head of the valet team looked up from his clipboard and went still. Then the first SUV came around the final curve of the drive, and then the second, and then the third. They parked in precise alignment. The lead SUV doors opened first. 2 men in dark suits, earpieces in, moving with the particular efficiency of professional security. They formed a loose perimeter without drama. Then the rear door of the center vehicle opened, Alistair stepped out first and turned back to offer his hand, and Evie stepped out into the savannah afternoon. The light hit her immediately, that September gold late afternoon, the kind that painters spend careers chasing, and the copper emerald caught it and held it and threw it back differently, so that for a moment she seemed to carry her own illumination. Her honey-brown skin glowed with a warmth that the white rose surrounding somehow deepened rather than diminished. Her dark hair was swept up. Her amber eyes, steady and unhurried, moved across the assembled guests with the calm of a woman who had expected an audience and was in no way altered by one. The silence that fell was not dramatic. It was the specific silence of a crowd recalibrating. Then it broke into whispers, the way silence always breaks. Not all at once, but in a spreading wave, person to person, like a stone dropped in water. Is that... She looks absolutely. Who is that man with her? That's Alistair Sterling, the Meridian capital Sterling. Wait, she married Alistair Sterling? She looks like royalty. Garrison said she couldn't keep up with his world. She came with a security detail. Maeve, stepping out of the third SUV, heard the whispers and kept her face perfectly neutral, though behind her sunglasses she was experiencing considerable private satisfaction. Alistair took Evie's arm. They walked toward the entrance at an unhurried pace, the security team falling into discreet positions around them, and every step was quiet and deliberate and entirely without performance. She was not trying to make an entrance. She was simply arriving. The entrance was happening regardless. Inside the main reception hall, the cocktail hour was underway. Champagne and small plates and the low hum of 200 well-dressed people performing the social rituals of the very wealthy. Garrison had been moved inside by his coordinator for final photographs when the word reached him. It was Theo who told him, appearing at his elbow with a glass of bourbon and an expression that was trying very hard to be casual. "Hey, Evie's here." Garrison turned. "I know, I invited her." "Yeah, man, but she came with Alistair Sterling." "A beat." "What?" "Alistair Sterling, Meridian capital. She came with him in 3 SUVs and there are like 8 people outside who work for him." Theo paused. "And she's..." "Garrison, she doesn't look like someone who came here to watch you get married. She looks like someone who..." "I heard you," Garrison said. He set down the champagne flute he had been holding. He was quiet for exactly 4 seconds, long enough to rearrange whatever had just shifted in his chest back into a configuration he could manage. "She's a guest," he said. "Stay with the coordinator." He walked. He found her near the garden fountain during the cocktail hour, which was either fate or his own deliberate navigation. He was not entirely sure which. She was standing at the edge of the stone path near the fountain's base, a glass of sparkling water in one hand. Not champagne, he noted, looking at the fountain's carved figure with an expression of quiet thought. The copper emerald moved gently in the evening breeze. Alistair was nearby, 20 feet away, deep in conversation with 2 men Garrison recognized as institutional investors. His large hand relaxed in his jacket pocket, his posture the absolute embodiment of a man who owned all the time he currently occupied. Garrison approached from behind and to the left. He did not announce himself. Force of habit, Evie did not startle. She turned before he reached her as if she had known he was coming. Her amber eyes met his with an expression he had not expected and did not know how to categorize. Not cold, not bitter, not the wounded dignity of a woman proving a point. It was closer to the expression a person has when they're completing something, when they're putting down a weight they've carried for a long time. "Evie," he said. He had planned this moment for weeks. He had rehearsed a version of it that was gracious and slightly magnanimous, that established the proper hierarchy. Him, arrived, her, witness. "I'm glad you came, truly." She looked at him without hurry. Let his words reach her and settle. "You look well," she said. Her voice was the same. Warm, low, unhurried. He had forgotten how unhurried her voice always was, as if she had never been in a rush in her life. "Savannah suits you." He felt the faint wrongness of the exchange. It wasn't going the direction he had rehearsed, and pressed forward. "I wanted you to see it," he said, and dropped the magnanimous framing, because something about the way she was looking at him made pretense feel suddenly exhausting. "Everything I built. I wanted you to see the summit I reached." Evie looked at him for a long moment. She reached into her copper clutch, and she placed something in his hand. He looked down. A small worn silver thumb ring, plain and simple, warm from being carried close to her body. He turned it over. He recognized it. His hand knew it before his memory did. And when his memory arrived a second later, it brought with it a cascade of images he had successfully buried for 3 years. A pawn shop on a February morning, the ring sliding across a glass counter. A few $100s he'd used for a software subscription that month. His fingers closed around it. "My mother's ring," Evie said quietly, still no anger. Just a clarity so complete it was almost physical. "You pawned it in February of our 2nd year. I never asked you about it because we needed the money, and I thought that was what you do when you love someone. You let things go without making them feel guilty for what survival cost." Garrison's throat moved. He said nothing. "Alistair tracked it through 3 transactions and bought it back for me." She paused, one beat, the pause of a woman who has thought about this moment long enough to know exactly where every word should land. He also bought 51% of Vance Logistical Systems. "Meridian Capital will be reviewing your CEO position first thing Monday morning." She held his gaze. "The document you initialed Thursday, page 31, I suggest you read it tonight." The blood drained from Garrison Vance's face in a progression she watched without satisfaction and without cruelty. Just witness. Just truth arriving in real time. His mouth opened. Nothing came. "I didn't come here to hurt you," Evie said, and she meant it. That was the thing about her. She always meant what she said, precisely and completely. "I came because I needed to close something." She glanced once briefly at the ring in his hand. "That ring doesn't belong in your world anymore, but it doesn't belong in my past either." She looked back up at him, and something in her amber eyes was gentle, not triumphant. "I hope the life you chose is worth what it cost." She picked up her sparkling water from the ledge where she'd set it. She walked back toward Alistair. Garrison stood at the fountain. The marble woman above him poured water from a vessel that never emptied, over and over, into the basin below. He looked at the ring in his palm, at the thin groove worn into the silver from 30 years on an old woman's hand, at the weight of it, which was considerably more than silver should weigh. Around him the cocktail hour continued. Glasses clinked. The string quartet shifted keys. 200 people moved in the warm September air, laughing and complimenting each other's outfits and discussing the floral arrangements. Garrison Vance stood completely alone at the center of all of it. And for the first time in a very long time, he felt the full weight of what he had built pressing down on him from every direction, and he was not sure the foundation was going to hold. End of chapter 3. Shall I begin chapter 4? The final chapter. The ceremony, the best man's speech, Cynthia's exit, and the last image of Evie in the back seat of the SUV as the convoy drives away into the savannah dusk. The ceremony began at 4 o'clock, as printed on the cream envelope. The guests moved from the cocktail hour to the ceremony lawn in that slow, pleasant drift of well-dressed people following invisible current. The white chairs were arranged in precise rows, an aisle of rose petals running between them toward the stone altar where Garrison now stood, his white tuxedo catching the late afternoon gold. He was standing. He was smiling. He was performing, but his left hand, hanging at his side, was closed in a loose fist around nothing. The ring had been slipped into his jacket pocket, and the knuckle of his thumb was pressing rhythmically into his palm, in the specific way a man presses when he is holding something together through sheer muscular effort. Theo stood beside him, oblivious, grinning at the crowd. Evie sat near the back 7th row aisle seat. Alistair beside her, his arm easy and warm against hers. Maeve 1 seat down, posture perfect, expression serene. Around them, guests who had spent the cocktail hour stealing glances now simply looked, openly, the way people look when social pretense has been quietly abandoned. The string quartet shifted into the processional. Cynthia appeared at the far end of the aisle. She was undeniably beautiful. The dress was architectural, ivory silk, cathedral train, fitted through the bodice in a way that had clearly cost someone an argument with a seamstress. Her platinum hair was swept back beneath a veil that caught the breeze like something from a painting. She walked slowly. Garrison watched her come toward him and arranged his face into the expression the moment required. But Cynthia's eyes, as she walked, moved once briefly involuntarily to the 7th row, to the copper emerald, to the woman sitting beside the tall man with grey eyes who was not watching the bride at all but looking at his wife with the quiet, focused attention of someone who had long since found everything he was looking for. Something moved across Cynthia's face. It lasted less than 2 seconds, and then it was gone. She reached the altar. Garrison took her hand. The officiant began. The vows were traditional. Garrison delivered his with precision and feeling, the way he delivered boardroom presentations, technically flawless, emotionally constructed. Cynthia's voice was steady. Her hands, Garrison noticed, were cold. From the 7th row, Evie listened without expression. She was not watching Garrison. She was watching the weeping willows at the estate's edge, their long branches moving in the September air, back and forth, patient and indifferent to everything happening beneath them. Alistair leaned slightly toward her, his shoulder pressed gently against hers. She pressed back, just barely, and that was enough. The vows concluded. The rings were exchanged. The officiant smiled at the assembled guests. "Before I pronounce this couple married, we'll hear a few words from the best man." Theo Burke stood up. Theo was the kind of man who had been the funniest person in every room he'd ever entered before age 25, and had spent the subsequent decade dining on that reputation. He had an instinct for the crowd-pleasing story, the puncturing detail, the anecdote that made everyone lean forward. He was also fundamentally not careful. He tapped his champagne glass, grinned at the assembled 200, and launched in. He told a story about business school. He told a story about Garrison's first terrible car. He told a story about the early startup years that got a warm laugh. And then, riding the energy of the room, feeling the crowd in his palm, Theo made the decision that would define the remainder of his friendship with Garrison Vance. "Garrison has always known exactly what he wanted," Theo said, gesturing expansively. "Always had a plan. I remember him telling me once." He pointed a finger at the groom with the enthusiasm of a man landing a punchline. He said, "Evie was great for the climb, Theo, but I had a blonde summit in mind." He laughed. 2 or 3 people near the front, who hadn't yet understood the geography of the room, laughed uncertainly. Then the laughter stopped. The silence that replaced it was the specific silence of 200 people simultaneously realizing what had just been said, and where and in front of whom. Heads turned. Eyes moved to the 7th row, to the copper emerald, to Evie, who was looking at Theo with an expression of complete, unruffled calm. Then every eye moved to Garrison. His face had gone the color of the white roses around him. Theo, registering the silence 3 full seconds too late, looked at Garrison, then at Evie, then at Garrison again. His mouth opened and produced nothing, but it was Cynthia who moved first. She turned to look at Garrison slowly. Not with shock, something worse than shock. Recognition, the cold calculation in his eyes, the fist closed at his side. The performance of warmth she had been watching him construct all day. It assembled itself suddenly into a coherent picture. The ex-wife invited to watch. The woman in copper emerald who had arrived in a convoy. The man beside her whose name had made 2 board members at the cocktail hour go very quiet. Cynthia Rose Laurent was 24 years old, and people had been making the mistake of assuming that meant she was unintelligent for 24 years. She looked at Garrison for a long moment. He looked back at her with something she recognized as damage control beginning to form behind his eyes. The opening of a sentence, the lean toward reassurance. She didn't give him the sentence. She reached up, removed her veil in one clean pull, set it on the altar stone. She looked down at her left hand. The engagement ring caught the light, enormous, blinding, architecturally perfect. She slid it from her finger, reached for the champagne glass the officiant's aide had been holding nearby for the toast, and dropped the ring into the champagne. It sank in a small spiral, settling at the bottom of the glass with a sound only the front row heard. She handed the glass to Garrison, then she picked up the cathedral train of her ivory dress with both hands, turned, and walked back down the rose-petal aisle with the steady, deliberate pace of a woman who had just made the clearest decision of her life. The crowd parted around her. No one said a word. At the estate entrance, she turned once and looked back, not at Garrison, but at the assembled faces, the white roses, the weeping willows, the whole beautiful hollow architecture of the afternoon. Then she was gone. Garrison stood at the altar. The champagne glass was in his hand. The ring rested at the bottom of it. Around him, 200 guests sat in white chairs in the September light and did not know where to look. Eleanor Vance in the front row was absolutely still, her couture dress and her manicured severity suddenly seeming very small inside the enormous silence. She was looking at her son with an expression that might have been concern, or might have been the first honest reckoning she had allowed herself in years. It was difficult to tell. Eleanor had spent so long maintaining composure that her face had nearly forgotten the difference. Franklin Cross, 3 rows back, looked at the champagne glass and then at the empty aisle and then at the man standing at the altar and thought about the Delaware filing and about the whispers in the market and felt a cold, clarifying certainty about several things he had been choosing not to fully understand. Theo Burke had sat down. He was looking at his shoes. Garrison did not move for a long moment. He was standing at the altar of the most expensive, most carefully constructed day of his life, holding a champagne flute with an engagement ring at the bottom in a white tuxedo, in front of everyone he had ever wanted to impress. The summit, it turned out, had no ground under it. In the 7th row, Evie stood. She smoothed the front of the copper emerald dress. She picked up her clutch. She looked once at Alistair, who was already on his feet, his hand open and waiting, and she took it. Maeve rose on her other side, silent and steady, and the 3 of them moved along the aisle edge toward the exit with the same unhurried calm with which they had arrived. Evie did not look at Garrison as she passed the altar. She had already said what she came to say. The ring was in his pocket. The truth was in the room. There was nothing left to add. The 3 SUVs were waiting where they had been left, the late afternoon sunning their black exteriors a deep, burnished amber. The security team moved efficiently. Doors opened, the convoy prepared. Evie got in last. The door closed. Inside the vehicle, the sounds of the estate muffled and then disappeared entirely. The air conditioning was cool and quiet. Savannah moved past the tinted windows as they pulled out of the gate, the stone walls, then the open road, then the long, pine-flanked highway stretching north. Maeve, in the front seat, said nothing. She looked out her window at the Georgia dusk beginning to deepen along the tree line, and she was quiet in the particular way of a person who has just witnessed something that has settled something in them too. Alistair loosened his tie. He turned toward Evie. She was already leaning into him, her head finding the place it had learned, the angle of his shoulder, the warmth just below his collarbone. His arm came around her without ceremony. His hand rested at the back of her shoulder. Outside, the pine forests rolled past. The sky was shifting, deep copper at the horizon, bleeding upward into violet, the first faint suggestion of stars beginning at the very edge of the east. It was the kind of sky her mother had loved. The driving home sky, Claudette used to call it. The sky that meant the work was done and the people you loved were where they should be. Evie closed her eyes. She felt the road beneath the car, steady and continuous. She felt Alistair's warmth and the slow, even rhythm of his breathing. She felt the small velvet square in her clutch, and inside it her mother's ring, returned, reclaimed home. She had not come for revenge. Revenge would have required her to still be wounded, and she was not wounded anymore. She was something else entirely, a woman who had walked through the fire her own love had built around her, and had come out the other side not harder but clearer, knowing exactly who she was, knowing exactly what she was worth, carrying her mother's name and her mother's ring and 3 years of work built on nothing but her own mind and the quiet, bone-deep support of a man who had never once asked her to be smaller. She slept not the shallow, vigilant half-sleep of a woman still braced for impact, the deep, full sleep of someone who has finished something completely, whose body finally believes what her mind has known for a while, that she is safe, that she is loved, that the past is behind her and the road ahead is entirely, irreversibly hers. The convoy moved north through the Georgia dusk, 3 black SUVs, unhurried, carrying a woman home the end.